of which she's not here as of yet. And of course, myself, Scott Powell. To help our audience follow along, I state each section of the agenda aloud. Additionally, I ask the committee members to raise their hand to speak, and I will call upon them. So we've done the introduction I guess the first item is the introduction of new audit committee member.
Yeah, I'm very happy to welcome Andrew Emery to the audit committee. This is his first meeting. Welcome, Andrew. And if you'll just take a couple of minutes and tell us a little bit about your background.
Hey, I'm Andrew Emery. I actually grew up here in Asheville a few years ago. I graduated twice from Western with my bachelor's and my master's, going to Biltmore Park here for the master's program. I've worked several years in tax and a couple of years in industry out at Meritor Automotive. And that's me in a nutshell.
Thanks, Andrew, and welcome.
The next item on our agenda is approval of our last meeting's minutes. Can I get a motion to approve when was the last minutes? March 3rd minutes.
Make a motion to approve minutes.
I guess I can second that. I'll second that. And as I call the committee member's name, if you would say yay or nay. Susan Hutchinson.
Yay.
Andrew Emery.
Yay.
Amy Kemp.
Yay.
Councilwoman Gwen Whistler. Your mic's off.
Gwen, you're muted.
I'm sorry. I have no idea what we're voting on, so I have to, I'll wait until the next thing.
Okay, wonderful. It was the minute.
Sorry.
It was it was March's minutes.
Then I'll vote for that. Sorry.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Gwen. And I will also vote aye as well. So that motion carries. The next item on the agenda is Finance Department Audit Findings Update, and we have Mr. McDowell to help go through this item. Tony?
All right. Well, thanks, Mr. Powell, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll run through a quick update. I don't have anything formal really for you all today in terms of slides or anything like that. But just kind of a reminder of what the finding was, and in particular for Andrew, who's new to the committee. When our external auditors presented at the last meeting you all had, they did identify a finding this year, and it related to our year-end closeout procedures and the timely and accurate preparation of some of the materials that we have to provide to them as part of that year-end closeout. And as a result of that, the delay, we were about 6 weeks late in submitting our audit this year. So just to kind of update you all, we had a corrective action plan that was included as a part of the audit, and just to kind of update you all on the steps that we've taken so far with that plan. If you all may recall from the last meeting, a lot of the issues with the previous audit stemmed from the fact that we had some fairly significant turnover in the finance department in the last half of calendar year 2020. Our controller and our financial reporting manager, who had been kind of those two folks had been the leads really on the audit for the last couple of years. Those folks left the organization. And then also in January of 2021, Barbara Whitehorn, our CFO, left as well. And so that turnover in and of itself created a lot of issues for us. And happy to report it as we, at the last meeting, we introduced you all to Caleb Lippert, our new controller. I think Caleb's with us today, and also Holly Ohm, our new financial reporting manager, who's also with us today. I can see Holly's face on the screen. And I'm happy to say, and there's Caleb as well, I'm happy to say they're still with us. and have been doing great work over the last few months to get us prepared for the upcoming audit. So we feel like we're in a good spot from a staffing perspective. We're also looking at adding at least one additional resource in the finance department in the accounting area, and we hope to be able to announce to the department and post a position next week that's going to be like an assistant director level position that's going to be responsible for accounting services. It's going to kind of bolster our staff capacity in that area. So I think that's one of the key things we wanted to highlight today, or that I wanted to highlight today. The other thing we're working on is working to better document our year-end procedures. Patricia, Holly, and Caleb and I met on April 29th, I think it was. Yeah, April 30th, I'm sorry, with some folks from Johnson Price Sprinkle to begin some conversations with them about them potentially helping us out as we go through the audit process this year. And that was a very productive meeting. They provided us with a good list of things that we might want to think about and consider as we move forward. And we kind of took their recommendations, and Holly and Caleb have been working on developing some specific checklists for us to kind of review where we're at now and the kind of things that we're going to need to get done between now and the end of the year, and then also the kind of things we're going to have to get done in the 13th month and after the auditors get here. And so we have a checklist with our monthly journals, our monthly reconciliations, as well as the year-end entries that we'll be doing as well. So I feel like we're making really good progress there, and happy to report that. The auditors are going to be on site. I think it's June 21st, Patricia, I think that they and Holly that they get here. So we'll definitely have more information to report as you all meet, and happy to answer any questions you all might have right now.
So does anyone have any questions for Tony? Hearing none, let's go to our next item, contracts management audit findings update. Patricia, could you give us an update on that?
Sure. So just a little background. And for the majority of 2019, the city underwent a performance audit on our contract management process. And it was really looking at our process and how we manage our contracts once they're in place. So from start to finish, I have included in the meeting materials the audit report. We contracted out a contract audit with a separate CPA firm, and they produced this report and came and spoke to our audit committee meeting last February. And then COVID hit and we all went remote, and we didn't have an audit committee meeting for over a year. So we haven't had many updates. And frankly, in putting and trying to implement the recommendations from that audit got put on hold for the majority of 2020. And the reason for that there's several reasons. And the big one was, as we scrambled to figure out how to work remotely, that included completely rehauling really our contracting process. And that's the process for getting contracts in place in the first place. So before last year, our contracting approval process was a manual process, and that it was a piece of paper, cover sheet paper, that manually was walked through all the departments and people who were part of the approval process before it got routed back and entered into our financial software. Obviously, that was really difficult to execute while we're all working remotely. And so that process became, it all became digital, and it all goes through Munis, which is our financial software now. It's a huge process improvement, but it did take some time implementing, and I'm proud to say that we executed it really quickly due to necessity. Another major lift that happened in the contracting world in 2020 was that the city passed a business inclusion policy, and it moved the city in our contracting process from race and gender neutral to race and gender conscious. I'm making sure I'm getting my language right. And that was passed and implemented as of January 1st of 2021. And so the people who were heavily involved in the contracting process were involved in both of those. Since then, we have picked up the work with the contract management audit, and we are working through the findings and implementations. So if you look through the audit report, I'm actually going to work backwards from the findings and backwards from the process. So one of the major findings was closing contracts once they're complete. There is a closeout process that happens to happen in Munis. And that process has been streamlined in part because we have been working remotely. The procedures are laid out really clearly now in One Asheville, and it's an all digital process for the city. So there's been a huge improvement for the closeout process. Our purchasing department is working to start sending out a list of open contracts that are that have either very little or no funding remaining on the contracts. They'll be sending those out to departments quarterly to be as a reminder to close out open contracts that look like they are substantially complete. They'll also be, so it will really happen for the first 3 quarters of the year. That's already happening at year end. And that process, even from the purchasing division, has become more robust. In years past, it was a passive ask for departments to review their open contracts and close out what was necessary. And that's become a more assertive process in that departments now have to verify why contracts need to stay open at year end. So really trying to push to make sure that contracts that once they are complete are getting closed and getting closed much more timely than they have been in the past. A second major finding that came out of the audit was the contract change order process. So that's any sort of change that happens from the original contract goes through a change order. And what has been happening in the past year, our city attorney has requested that all contract change orders get reviewed by the legal department. So that could be for substantial change orders, if it's a substantial change in scope, a substantial change in money, if it's asking for a date extension, or it could be something as small as changing some really minor language in the contract. Our legal department is reviewing all of them. And so that's just helped provide more consistency with our change order process. And it also means that the change orders are getting more scrutiny over the necessity of them. So that's really been a major process improvement that we've seen since the audit. The last major finding that came out of this was having clear policies and procedures around our management process. As we've been working through that internally, we do have a group of staff who are helping to put together procedures. The purchasing and contracting policy has been updated recently in the past year. And after that update, we discussed whether and that really focuses more on getting the process to get a contract in place. And this audit focused more on after a contract is already in place. The management of it. And we have talked a lot about whether a policy is necessary or if it's really procedures. Right now, we're working through procedures, trying to avoid having yet another policy that might confuse staff. If anything, the contracting and purchasing policy might point to the procedures of once you have a contract in place, here's what you need to follow. And we'll continue to provide updates for Audit Committee, but that's something that's currently being worked on. So that's what I have about the contract management audit. Are there any questions about what has been done and what work is still ongoing?
Could you provide us with copies of the documents?
What
the updated procedures and or policy? You said you updated the policy. So I was wondering if we could take a look at the content now that it's been updated.
Absolutely. I think that's a good thing that I'll have come presented at our August meeting, if that's okay, Amy. And it'll be the new contracting and purchasing policy, I believe. And I'll have them come present that. And when we have procedures for the management of the contract, we'll present those as well. I'm not sure the timing of that quite yet. If they're done by August, we'll present that. If not, then we'll present them when they are complete. Absolutely.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Any other questions?
One more question. I'm just curious, how did everybody accomplish that with all this turnover? Like, how were you able to, you must have worked really hard, or was the weight pulled in the purchasing department, or?
It was, I mean, the contracting and purchasing policy and the business inclusion policy were both interdepartmental teams that pushed that. And it was, it stemmed mostly from the purchasing division for sure. But I know there were people involved. Our business inclusion office was involved. Our capital projects office was involved. The Office of Equity and Inclusion has been involved in that process. So it's really been a collaborative interdepartmental effort.
Okay. Good job.
Okay, the next item is just to get a internal audit update from Patricia.
All right. So one of the major things that I wanted to talk about here in Audit Committee today is the American Rescue Plan funding. So if you are not aware, as part of the American Rescue Plan Act that was passed by Congress in March of this year, part of what was passed in that is that every municipality in the country is receiving a large amount of money, funding to help with COVID-19 relief efforts. And the city has been awarded $26.2 million as part of that plan. That is probably the largest single grant award that the city has ever received. So it's a really exciting time. It's also a little overwhelming. We have put together a core group, and actually we've had a core group since last year when we began receiving COVID-19 grants. And there were several different grants through the CARES Act. The Department of Justice handed down a grant to our police department. The FTA handed a grant to our transit system. And so there were several different grants. So we put together a core group of city employees to help manage those grants and the process and the awards to make sure that we weren't crossing our expenses, we weren't double dipping and trying to submit the same expense to multiple grants, and just making sure that we were all on the same page and that all the grant funding was being properly used. Since then, with the award of the $26.2 million from the American Rescue Plan, that group has continued and has shifted focus mostly on the new funding that we'll be receiving. And as part of that, I have been named the project manager, at least in the interim, for this. So that really has been the bulk of what I have been working on in the past couple months. So the Treasury Department just released guidance on how the funds can be spent last week. That was a 151-page document that's been reviewed and summarized for city employee use. And the group of employees who have been working on this funding have really we've outlined 3 critical paths that we need to be taking simultaneously. So we put together 3 small groups to work on those paths. One group is working on a job description. One of the funding uses can be for positions to help manage the grants. Like I mentioned, $26 million is a really substantial amount for the city, and we want to make sure that we're doing it properly. And that helps city employees are at or beyond capacity. So it's helping build capacity to make sure that we're managing those properly over the next few years. So we have a group of people who are working together to put together a job description so that we can post a grant manager position. It's what I'm calling it temporarily, but we'll see what ends up coming out from that job description and from that work group. There is a separate group that is working on creating an evaluation matrix as we come up with potential funding uses for for this grant funding, we want to make sure that we're evaluating it, and we've created a list of guiding principles to be used. And at the core of that is making sure that we're using an equity lens, that we are being collaborative with other municipalities. That includes collaborations with the county, with other local governments, and potentially other partners in the community, to really maximize the funding that we're receiving. And make sure that the funding aligns with our strategic priorities and the council's strategic priorities. And making sure that it aligns with community engagement. So through those guiding principles, we are coming up with an evaluation matrix so that we feel like we are making the best recommendations of how to use the funds. So that's the second small group that's been established and that is going to be working over the next few months. The third group is a group that is that's going to be will be really pouring through data that we've already collected. Something that we've heard a lot recently is that we have done a lot of community engagement for several major projects in the city, and our community is getting a little fatigued with engagement. So our plan is to use the data that's already been collected through community engagement efforts, and that's through efforts like our Reimagining Public Safety, through our budget engagement process this past year, through comp plan engagement, through council priorities engagement. Our sustainability office has done community engagement, and using all the information and all the data that we've already collected to formulate a plan, to really hear what the community is interested in and what the community needs are, to formulate a list of potential funding uses. And once we have that list created, then that will go through the evaluation matrix. Obviously, this is a lot of work that is going to be done over the next few months. As part of the guidance that the Treasury Department released last week, we are required to submit a funding plan by August 31st to the Treasury Department. So we have a timeline, and it feels really, really fast, and we're going to work really hard, and we're going to put together a great plan. We want to be thorough, we want to be thoughtful, and we want to make sure that we are using this funding to best serve our community needs. I'm gonna pause there because I just gave a lot of information about one of the major projects I'm working on, and ask if y'all have any questions or comments or thoughts or feedback.
I mean, I definitely have a comment, and I think it's great, Patricia. I'm glad that you're doing this, and it puts you outside though of the role of internal auditor. So, the audit committee is here to focus on financial, if I understand correctly, financial and fiduciary matters. But does it broaden our scope? Does it change our scope as we interact with you? Or, how much are we involved in this process, given the nature of our committee? I mean, we had a little bit of question at the beginning as we formed this committee about those kind of things. So
I think that's a great question, Amy. And in all honesty, I would say that the majority of the work that I am doing with the American Rescue Plan funds is outside of the scope of Audit Committee. I wanted to give a really good outline of the work that I'm doing because I think it will help. I'm helping to frame the work that's being done in the internal audit office and acknowledging that this is outside the scope of normal internal audit work. And part of that, I guess, is asking about your comfort level. I mean, as a committee with that, because it is outside the scope of an audit, and it does compromise my independence, which means that I will not be able to ever perform an internal audit on these funds. That said, if it was ever, a couple things. One is that it will almost it will most likely be subject to the single audit. So it will get audited independently anyways.
Okay.
It would be something that if there were concerns about any, that it needed to go through an internal or performance audit, that is something that we could contract out. And that could be outside of my scope. And it's something that honestly, I have a really, really great working relationship with the internal auditors at Buncombe County. And it's something that we have talked about potentially being able to bring each other in to audit. And this came up in something that I've heard a lot in government internal audit, in the governmental internal audit world, is that there are a lot of us who have gone outside of the scope of internal audit over the past year. When faced with crises, there was a conference that I attended a few weeks ago, and there was an internal auditor from Oregon who said that really he feels like his role more than anything is to protect the interests and the safety of his community. And he said that he was married to the city that he's worked in. He's married to his community. He is not married to internal audit specifically. And I feel like that was something that really resonated with me. Yes, that does, my role in managing these grant funds does pull me outside of internal audit, and it probably pulls outside of the scope of the audit committee. But I think it's important enough, and it's important enough for the city to get right and to do it successfully and well. And it's something that I feel really strongly and passionate about, that I'm okay with. And I hope that the audit committee will be okay with that as well.
Patricia, you did state that, as it stands now, that's what your current capacity is. However, you are going to be engaging, additional staff that will be doing the hands-on managing of these funds. Is that correct?
That is correct. Like I said, I'm not doing this work alone. It's not possible to manage $26 million alone, obviously. And we do already have a core group of employees who are meeting. We have a small group of employees that are meeting every Tuesday morning, and a larger group that includes the smaller group that are meeting Wednesdays. We're meeting twice weekly, and now with the addition of these small groups, as much as 3 times weekly to work through these funds. So there are other employees who are helping with this. And I mentioned that one of the things that we're working on is a job description to help build capacity. So long term, that may mean that my role will roll more back into internal audit and less involved with these funds. I'm not exactly sure what that looks like right now, and won't until we have a firm job description and someone hired in that role.
It sounds to me like, as a result of COVID, we all have had to take another look at the way we viewed things and the boundaries that we put around things. And so maybe we have what we would call a non-traditional internal audit, or, just a different approach to that. And I like that because, you mentioned about your passion and the way you feel about your role and what you can contribute, and you can contribute something differently in this situation. And it's when we step outside of our boundaries and do those kind of things that we really can make a difference, because you have a different perspective from the other side, for a number of years. So
I certainly hope so. Thank you, Amy.
Patricia, you stated that you've been having dialogue with the internal auditors of Buncombe County. Has the administration of both the city and county, you know what happens when we assume, but I assume that they are aware of that, that communication and the possibility of some kind of collaborative effort as it pertains to these monies and how these things potentially would get internally audited if there is a need.
I suspect not. Like I said, I have a strong working relationship with them. At this point, it has just been informal discussions. And part of it stemmed because so Buncombe County has 2 internal auditors, and one of them was reassigned to work in emergency services for the vast majority of last year. And so it was something that they documented as an independence issue. And part of that documentation was the potential ask, if ever necessary, to have me out. Whether our city council and our city management would agree with that, whether Buncombe County's county commission and county management would agree with that, at this point, it really has just been informal discussions. So there's certainly no formal agreement in place.
Thank you.
Anything else about American Rescue Plan funds? Okay, so the second part of my update, I had mentioned in March that I was starting a risk assessment. I do an annual risk assessment for the city that helps identify my audit plan. But what I was looking to start is to do something much broader in scope than a normal risk assessment. It's something that would involve working with all levels and all departments to capture a much bigger audit universe and do a deeper dive really into a risk assessment for the city. It's something that, and so part of what I had planned when I talked about it in March was to give you all an update on where I was. That has changed significantly with my role with the American Rescue Plan funding. I think an in-depth risk assessment is something that is still on my long-term work plan, but in all honesty, I have not gotten very far with it. It is at the very initial stages of research and has not been launched citywide yet. Questions about that? And that's a really quick update, but the update really is that I don't have much of one.
Patricia, when do you envision, and I know this is a loaded question, when do you envision starting this risk assessment?
Likely when I become more of full-time internal auditor. So that will depend really heavily on the job description and long-term plan of bringing in a grant manager for the American Rescue Plan funds, and when we have someone new to help administer that, what my role looks like there. With an additional capacity, it will at least add capacity for me to return back to, if not full-time, at least free up more time. And that's when I'll start getting into a risk assessment. At this point, though, I don't have a firm timeline on what that looks like.
Patricia, this is Gwen. So, I mean, given that, frankly, you're not really functioning in the internal audit role much, if any, right now, does it make sense for us to sort of suspend audit committee meetings for a while until it becomes clear, until you get back to that role? I mean, because frankly, you shouldn't really, we shouldn't be hearing about the ARPA because that's really not our job. Does it just make sense to, cancel until such time as you can get back at it? Or what's your proposal around that?
It wouldn't be my recommendation, and here's why. First of all, if we met monthly, it probably would be. But because we meet quarterly, our next scheduled meeting is in August. And I suspect that we'll be able to spend a good chunk of that time, one, talking about contracting and purchasing, and follow up on the contracting audit. So that is work that I am still involved with that I think is speaking heavily to the internal audit role. And then the major update that I think is really pertinent to the audit committee is that we will be beginning our financial audit at that point. And so to be able to come back to the audit committee and give you an update on what the year-end close, where we are in August through our year-end close process and preparing for the FY21 audit, I think for me is enough to warrant having the August meeting. And then the November meeting will be, as usually scheduled, we'll be hearing the financial audit presentation, because we will be on time this year.
That makes sense to me, that we continue to have the meetings just because of the financial oversight and the fact that it doesn't sound like you're going to not be doing your job in internal audit. You're just going to be doing this other job plus your job in internal audit. And maybe, it will give us more to think about in the future because of the things that I guess you will learn as a result of going through this process. And ultimately, what I would like to hear about is how that influences, the way we look at equity and the way you look at equity and how that plays itself out in the community. Because if I understand correctly, that's what you're wanting to look at. And Gwen, I guess, as far as that's concerned, City Council would want our participation in looking at things from an equity lens, on the back end, and now, on the front end, hearing how that plays itself out. So there's a bridge there, in conversation that otherwise sometimes is limited to just looking at some numbers that don't have any relationship to the human condition in a lot of cases. So I feel like there's something to be learned. I don't know how you feel about that, Gwen, but it sounds like there is to me.
No, I'm fine with continuing the meetings. I just, it'll be interesting how quickly you can get back to or out of the ARPA work.
I doubt I will roll out of ARP entirely. That's what I'm saying right now. And really it's with the release of, of the plan, it's, the act itself. And, I mentioned that the city is getting $26.2 million. That was one pot of, I don't even know how many pots of money that were allocated through that. And so there was a lot of research and information and studying that was done of the different pots of money that the city might directly receive. Our transit is once again receiving money through the ARPA. We are receiving money through our HUD program. Yes, but that's more, but the city is the administrator of a 4-county region. So the funding, the city's the administrator, but it serves, that pot of money serves a broader, beyond just Asheville. There's the potential, we have applied for the Shuttered Venues Operators grant. So, which was, and there was funding in the ARPA for that. So managing, there are a lot of pots of money in the ARPA that relate to a lot of different city initiatives. There are a lot of pots of money in that aren't necessarily directly tied to city initiatives, but that our community is going to be very interested in and applicable to a lot of different community needs. So doing the research in there and then having the guidance that was released by the Treasury Department that's specific to the $26.2 million that the city's receiving has required a significant amount of effort. And as we formulate a plan, that's requiring a significant amount of effort. I think once we have a clear plan of how we're going to use this funding, I don't know what that workload will look like for me. And once we have a grant manager, I don't know. I will continue to be involved with that. But I think that long term, I I mean, I can see that there's the potential for me to be able to get back into doing a risk assessment and start performing performance audits again. So while we continue to manage American Rescue Plan funding.
And so again, to my comment before, I mean, there is a lot of opportunity here for mismanagement of funds. So it sounds like, does it fit your role in internal audit? 100,000% it fits that role, because we are fiduciaries for funding coming from the federal government. So, if we're going to state what our goals and objectives are with that funding and then trace that, I actually had to do some applications as well myself recently. And it was interesting, to go through and realize that you have to provide documentation to substantiate every single thing that you do with those funds, like every single piece of everything needs to be documented. It has to be projected on the front end and then documented as being used in that manner on the back end. So it not only would be easy to mismanage the funds, but also to lose track of things if we don't have good processes and procedures in place, or at least that was my observation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a major goal of what I see my role being with these funds, is making sure none of that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And these funds won't affect the 2021 audit per se. It'll be 2022 going forward.
Most likely. I say most likely because we have, Tony and Holly, y'all could correct me, I believe we actually received the first half of that money yesterday. So I don't know what that looks like for FY21 audit. And because there haven't been really clear standards and an outline of what that is going to look like from a single audit perspective when we've received the funds, but at this point it's unearned revenue because we haven't spent anything yet. And there will be probably very minimal that gets spent by June 30th. I'm not going to say nothing, but certainly not as much as we're receiving.
And the CARES Act funding that came through will affect this year's audit.
Yes.
So there has been some funding, that the city's gotten from the federal government. It's just not this ARPA fund.
Correct.
So Patricia, do you anticipate that this year's audit contract, you might have an addendum to it pertaining to these federal funds and single audit or anything to that effect?
I don't. I mean, the CARES Act was included in the FY20 audit and was a major program that was selected because it was a new program. So that made it an automatic selection, but it didn't add a new audit program. My initial guess is that will probably be true for the American Rescue Plan funds as well, is that it'll be a new program. It will be selected because it's a new program as one of the major programs under the single audit, but I don't know if it will add an additional program that would change the scope of the contract for our financial audit.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I have one last major update, and that is, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Patricia.
No, go ahead.
The City Council is actually going to be approving the new audit contracts this coming at the meeting on Tuesday night.
Correct.
Not that this isn't really probably part of our scope per se, but would you mind copying all of the Audit Committee on that consent agenda item and the contract, just so they have that information?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll send out the Audit Committee that contract and the staff report and all the materials that are going to council on Tuesday. So y'all should look for that probably tomorrow.
Thank you.
And then one more update that I wanted to give y'all, and I'm going to do a little bit of an overview because we do have a couple of new members on Audit Committee, and that is the ethics hotline that the city has. So the city does have and manage an ethics hotline. That's something that specifically is charged to the Internal Audit Office. So it's something that I manage, and it is contracted out with a third party. Part of the meeting materials, and it was just added this morning, so if you haven't looked at them today, but there is the FAQs that we have posted for employees. Our ethics hotline is limited to employees, and if y'all have questions about what that looks like and why, I'm happy to go into that, but I feel like it might be a little bit into the weeds, and I've done a lot of talking today. But we do have an ethics hotline, and I do periodically come to Audit Committee and give y'all an update. It has not been a surprise that it has seen less volume in the last year or two because of remote work, I think, and because of the change in how we have worked has been so significant that I think it has been hard to filter a lot through the hotline. That said, in 2020, we received 4 ethics hotline reports. For what is probably obvious reasons for all of you, I don't ever go into detail about what specifically what's in those reports, but I'll give you some high level. So of the 4 reports we received in 2020, 2 were related to discrimination complaints and 2 were policy violations. So far in 2021, this year, we've received 2. One's been a policy violation and one's been, I guess I would call it an embezzlement claim. I will say that was a top report and it was very much unsubstantiated. I think if something rose to that level, y'all would certainly hear about it. Specifically though, I want to talk a little bit about the policy violations because we have received, of the 6 complaints, they've been half. It's really, the policy violations have really revolved around the mask policy and wearing those in when people are working in city buildings and in the public. And so those have been concerns about non-compliance with our mask policy over the past year, which again is also something that is not surprising given the pandemic. And the entire climate of what this past year and a half has looked like.
Patricia, can I ask, what's it cost? How much have you paid? We talked before about the cost of the ethics hotline, and we talked about a broader use of it, but we talked about how it would cost money. So I'm just wondering, can we talk about that again?
Sure. So we have an annual contract with Navex Global. They're the third party that manages our hotline. And right now we are paying, I think it's either 51 or 5,200 is how much that contract is for.
Does that cover so much activity, or how does that work? Like
it's a combination of potential users and activity. So we were initially priced that because our potential users are the number of employees, which is about 1,400 employees for the city of Asheville. We have asked, and I've had conversations with Navex Global specifically about if we opened up the hotline to become something that became open to the public and what that would look like. And I have, and they could price that out initially, but they said that ongoing costs will depend heavily on the volume. And I will say, given the activity that we see in the city of Asheville, I would expect that volume to increase dramatically. And they said that our contract could go from $5,000 to, when they quoted to open that, it would probably be, at least for the first year, an additional $10,000 to $15,000. But if there was significant volume, the next year's contract could be as much as $40,000 or $50,000 or $60,000.
Did they say they'd ever done that for anybody before?
They have. And the major concern there is that it's the first year is an anticipated volume. And so it's kind of an estimate, a cost estimate. And the struggle becomes once you open it to the public and the call volume increases significantly and the cost increases significantly, trying to pull that back out of the public if the agency can no longer fund that. I will say that at the city, we have a really tight budget. That's not something that I personally, in the internal audit budget, have the ability to take on. And beyond that, as a department of one and the only person who manages the ethics hotline, I do investigate everything that comes in through that. And right now, that feels really manageable at 4 calls a year. If that even doubled, that's still manageable for me. If we open that to the general public and that became 100 calls a year, I certainly cannot do that alone. So it would require more than just the cost of the contract. It would require staffing capacity as well.
Right, totally. But I think that the reason I'm bringing it up is because we have so much unrest amongst the public. It seems like, we have a situation where the public doesn't trust what's going on in the government. You have these grant funds, right? So the grant funds you're going to use in a way that we determine to be collaborative and in conjunction with the community. But we have situations where there are apparent ethical violations that are not within any kind of reason. And I recently came across one when you may be aware of it, but the best that I could tell, there was a big ethical violation that occurred with a Montford newspaper and taking business or advertisers away from the newspaper because of having a position on a development. So how does that work? I mean, how does the public gain confidence in the city when we have city people that are doing those things? And it looks like there's a collusion. It looks collusive, if that's a word. But I scratched my head when I heard about it because the best that I can tell, we have an ethical violation for a city council member. And I'm on the call with her right now, which is uncomfortable for me. But I mean, nonetheless, I'm in this role because I'm a responsible community member.
Amy, I'm happy to talk to you about that. That was not done on city council business. That was my personal response to that. I wrote that on my individual email.
It's the ethical.
Amy, can we talk about this?
We can certainly talk about it, but
And
I mean, I'm
to...
scratching my head with the whole thing, and I think
Amy, this is not the venue for this. If you're going to blindside a council person in this meeting, I don't have meetings like that. Okay, so if we are talking about the process of how we are using the current items, that's wonderful. How we can help staff in accomplishing their goals, that's wonderful. Individual items, I think if you want to do that, that needs to go at the city council level or Gwen personally. That's not what this committee is about.
Well, the committee clearly is about more than what we initially have put on paper. We talked about it from the beginning. We're talking about it with Patricia, and I personally am a CPA. And I'm going to say this, I have to deal with ethics for 2 hours every year. Okay, we all do as CPAs. So as CPAs on this call, what I'm saying is important because when we talk about ethics, we are held to the highest ethical standards and we have to say something. It's not in our world that we can walk away from an ethical situation, whatever that looks like. Okay, so I'm not going to take this to another place and act like ethics has nothing to do with this committee. I think we need to all acknowledge that it does.
Well, I can appreciate your opinion, but that's one person's opinion. And as I stated, as the chairperson of this committee, if this is the type of stuff that we're going to be doing, I think I just cannot condone that, period. And I would say the same thing, Amy, if someone did that to you or to Susan or to Andrew or to anyone that works at the city of Asheville. That's not what this is about here.
I don't want it to be about anything like that, Scott. I don't want to hear about these things. I live in this city and I don't want to hear about these things. I'm not trying to blindside Gwen. I helped Gwen get elected.
Really?
I did.
I'm sorry. That's what this is about.
Get her elected. For sure. But when I hear things as an audit committee meeting that have to do with ethics, and I am held to the standards by the AICPA, I'm required to be a CPA to be here. Okay, I've faced many ethical situations as a CPA. I don't back down from them. I'm not known for that.
Have you brought this to the city council's?
I just learned about it. It just came to my attention as an audit committee meeting, and I scratched my head and I read the ethics policy, and here we have an audit committee meeting. We haven't had an update on ethics, so I don't feel I'm in any way out of place, Scott. I mean, I can hear where you want to be defensive, but if I understand ethics correctly, as a city council member, you represent everybody's interest, and you're not supposed to make a decision until you have a vote or a case brought before you. Like all the time, you're on as a city council member. You can't just shut it off and go be a private citizen and say, I'm going to sabotage that magazine. No way. That is not right.
Amy, I'm going to agree with Scott, and I think we're really going off the rails of what
and I'm sorry that I wanted to explain myself because of what Scott said and made it sound like I was out of place, and I don't feel like I'm out of place at all. But I appreciate what you're saying, and I will definitely talk to Gwen.
Okay. And Andrew, you have your hand up.
Hey, I got a couple of quick ones. So Patricia, you said the ethics, this may be a little beyond the scope of this committee, but the ethics hotline is only for basically internal city employees. Do you have any involvement with any outside ethics complaints, or is there even an avenue for just regular citizens to approach that?
There isn't, and that's part of that is something that we have talked about, and part of why we have had conversations in the past about expanding that. There are general avenues of reporting to, city council information is out there. City manager's office information is out there. And quite frankly, all city employee information is out there. But I will say specifically, so there are ways for the public to make complaints in a lot of different functions. And one of them is reaching out personally to me. That said, the hotline in particular is a huge benefit of having the hotline is for anonymity of our employees. I think that becomes less of a concern with citizens. Not that it's not a concern entirely, but I've talked about for a lot of reasons why we haven't expanded. Budget constraints and capacity constraints as well. But the anonymity part is why we focused more on employees than the general public. There are avenues, but there's not a really direct one in the same way as for employees.
Okay, and like I said, I think it may be a little beyond the scope of this, this committee here. So it sounds like you wear an awful lot of hats there at the city right now, and I know what you've talked about sounds like you've been pretty busy with this American Rescue Plan work as well. Has that impacted you in your role as an internal auditor for the upcoming financial close?
It hasn't. As far as the financial close itself, I'm not involved. And when I speak about the financial audit, that has not been the case this past year because of staff turnover. But generally speaking, my role with the financial audit is that I manage the contract. And our finance department manages the audit itself.
You don't have any sort of stepped up testing halfway through the year to kind of try to catch anything that may be coming loose? just over time or with staff turnover. I know these things happen.
I don't, and that's because I'm a department of one person. So that's about capacity, truthfully.
No, I mean, that makes sense. It sounds like you have a lot of hats on right now. So those were my questions. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions I know I went through a lot of what I've been working on, but.
Patricia, we thank you for that extended commentary on all what you've been doing and what you have been doing. And we definitely thank Tony and his staff for all the hard work that they've done to get the audit in and working forward to deal with, the management points and going forward for this upcoming year's audit. Is there anything else? Do we want to talk about what we would like to see at the next committee? Any potential agenda items that you might see would be very good for us to take a look at, Patricia?
I mean, I think the two major things are we'll come back with an update on the financial audit and where we are. And that'll be due to the timing of Audit Committee. We'll be telling you how prepared we are going into that audit and what the year-end closing process looked like for us. So that's a big one. And then I'll continue to I'll give you another update. I'll come back with the updated contracting and purchasing policy. I'm going to try really hard to have someone else because I was not super involved with the creation of that policy, but have someone come in who can speak really well to that. And then I'll give you an update on where we are with the findings from the contract management audit and where we are getting procedures for that. Are there any other requests from Audit Committee members for the August meeting? Scott, you're muted.
My wife would say that's the best part of doing Zoom meetings is they can mute me. But that being said, I think at this point in time, do we have a motion to adjourn the meeting, or do we need to have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second. Do we need to do a roll call or can we do a voicemail?
You need to do a roll call vote.
Okay, roll call. Okay, wonderful. Susan?
Aye.
Andrew?
Aye.
Amy?
Aye.
Thank you. Gwen?
Aye.
And I as well. Thank y'all for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.